So we are at a very tricky, ticklish, awkward time in our relationship. And I think there's a time here for some cool thinking and cool heads. And in this regard, I must say that I do compliment the Prime Minister on her initiative in introducing the study on Australia in the Asian century. The Australian Institute of International Affairs has had meetings with the members of the inquiry committee that have been charged with the responsibility of producing the white paper. And it's fair to say that our relationship now with Asia is challenged not just by all of the traditional obvious obstacles, such as the language barrier, the cultural barrier, the distance barrier, but it's challenged now by the economic barriers and the relationship barriers and the trade and investment barriers. Therefore, it's very timely that the Institute should be thinking about how it should respond and how it should provide input to this inquiry, which, as I say, the Prime Minister has initiated, and where the Secretary of the Treasury, Ken Henry, has been appointed the chairman of the committee to come up with a white paper, a draft white paper. The position now is that we have two major white papers underway. We've got an energy white paper and we've got the Asian century white paper. The energy white paper is being masterminded by the Department of Resources and Energy and the Minister, Martin Ferguson. The Asian century white paper has been masterminded by the Prime Minister's Department and by the Prime Minister herself. One of the points that the Energy Policy Institute has emphasised is the importance of getting alignment between the relevant policies. We see the need for alignment between energy policy and foreign policy, and the alignment between environmental policy and climate change, and in turn alignment with the country's economic policy. So we don't have the luxury anymore of saying, this is what I think about this particular policy, and stamping your foot on the ground and saying, this is the way it should be done. These days, it's much, much more complex than that. There's a need for policy alignment, which means if you can't take a position on energy policy unless you understand how it fits in with the alignment that the government has taken on climate policy and on economic policy generally, and what it means for the Australian economy, and on foreign policy in terms of what this means for Australia's relationships with Asia, and in particular its important customers in Asia.
Thanks, Bob. That's really appropriate. And one thing you didn't mention in that was, of course, defence policy. And we've seen in the last few days, as a result of the Washington Post, leaking the fact that there have been discussions between the Australian government and the American government on the establishment of an American air base on Cocos Island, right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which of course the Chinese are not very happy about, nor the Indians. And the possibility of this base being a base for drones. The Americans have already got other bases for drones, but there's clearly an issue here, and the Defence Minister, Stephen Smith, I think, it's fair to say, was rather caught out on this, and you will have seen him sort of, to be frank, wriggling on the media, trying to pretend that this wasn't something that had been discussed because he hadn't been involved in the discussions, but clearly his officials have. I think it's fair to say that apart from the energy policy dimension and the resources policy dimension and the foreign policy dimension, and clearly Bob Carr has a slightly different view of foreign policy, I think, than the Prime Minister, at least that's coming across. is different from what Rudd had, but it's also different from what Julia Gillard has, I think. There's also the rewriting of the Defence White Paper going on up in Canberra, and we don't know where that's going to lead to.
Thank you for leading me into what is really, really an important thing for us in the Institute, I think, for us to be thinking about right now, the conjunction of these three white papers. And I'm not altogether certain that the government really knows what it's got itself in for. Because at the heart of Australian foreign policy lies this dilemma, this contradiction that goes back a really, really long way, which is that we have trade partners of enormous significance, we have alliance partners of enormous significance, and we have Australia's own interests. And sometimes those things coincide and sometimes they don't. And most of the time, up to now, we have assumed that they did. We've been a very comfortable country for a very long time. And following on from what Rob was saying, I think that we are entering some sort of choppy waters. The reason that this is happening is that what Napoleon first predicted about China is taking place. We had a warm-up with Japan. We did some quite smart things with Japan. And we need, it seems to me, to apply what we learnt from that experience to China. Are we doing so? I'm not at all certain that we are. When the Prime Minister said, following Ken Henry's advice obviously on his retirement, that this is what he wanted to do, was to run a thing about the Asian century, I sort of went, we've been there. The Asian century, if you weren't asking Canberra, started 100 years ago in the minds of a large number of Japanese and Chinese intellectuals, and indeed Indian, and has progressed for a long time in the literature and come up most recently through Singapore with the writings of Mark Udani and others, with the Asian Renaissance. And it's as though the penny has sort of slowly dropped down through the slots and reached the bottom in Australia and gone ping. And Ken Henry goes, we're in an Asian century. Give us a break. I mean, we all know this. This institute knows this. Our forefathers in this place, and they wrote about this in the 1930s. They knew all about it. This is not new stuff. My worry about it is that the economists have got hold of it. And what they really want is, by talking about an Asian century, is an epoch in which Australia understands how important Asia is and how importantly we are juxtaposed, which Bob Hawke said, for God's sake, at close to sources of tremendous economic advantage for us. And we all know this. This is not new stuff. So, what is the other thing in all of this? What is missing? And I was so amazed when Julia Gillard, in her title, said it was going to be a white paper on the Asian century. She didn't say the Asia Pacific century, did she? Now, what does the Asia Pacific century mean? Every time someone says the Asia Pacific century, what we're saying is, and the west coast of the United States and Hawaii. In other words, business as usual. Right? It's not Australia having a relationship with our neighbours that is about us and about them. No, it's about the other side of the Pacific as well. And that immediately escalates it from an independent foreign policy for Australia, which it might be, which is just here, to the tried and true alliance relationship that has always kept us at a distance from our Asian neighbours. And so I was very relieved when Julia Gillard said this is an Asian century, not an Asia-Pacific century. you'll find people over at the low end talking all the time about Asia Pacific. They always say Asia-Pacific because that means Australia-United States. Kevin Rudd did all the time. And that's where he lost out when he put up in a big hurry his little plan for an Asia-Pacific small C community. The countries in the region know this. They can decode this. They know what an Asia-Pacific community means. That means the East Asian community plus the United States, plus Australia, which seconds everything that the United States wants in the region. So when this came up, I thought, hey, at last, we're getting somewhere. We're at last going to get somewhere where we have some form of relationship with our neighbours that doesn't necessarily have to do with American strategic objectives.
You see, one of the real problems with this, and it's entirely fortuitous that we're discussing this tonight, but Ali and Bob are right, this is not being debated. It's not being debated in the Parliament. It's not really being debated in the media. The media we've had this sort of argument as whether we've got to be friends with China or friends with the States with Hugh White. But when you actually examine Hugh White in great detail, this is a very superficial thing. It doesn't really go into detail. The Indian Ocean is arguably much more important to Australia than the Pacific. And I'm going to put my 2 pence in here, because most of Australia's resources flow through the Indian Ocean. 40% of the world's seaborne oil trade flows through, first of all, the Straits of Hormuz, and then a good bit of that goes through the Straits of Malacca. So the Indian Ocean is of huge importance. There are more Islamic countries on the Indian Ocean than anywhere else in the world, and they are rising in strength, particularly Iran. So we really need to look at the world through a slightly different focus than what we have done for many, many years. And this is what we're trying to do tonight, I guess.